Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Ask the Expert, presented in partnership between the County of Simcoe, the Small Business Centre of Barry, Simcoe County and Orillia, the South Georgian Bay Small Business Enterprise Centre, Orillia Area Community Futures Development Corporation, Nottawasaga Futures, North Simcoe Community Development Corporation, Community Futures South Georgian Bay, Sandbox, and the Henry Bernick Entrepreneurship Centre, Georgian College. My name is Tim Newton, and I'm the manager of the South Georgian Bay Small Business Enterprise Centre, and today I will be your moderator. We are joined this morning by Pierre Cleroux, VP, Research and Chief Economist at the Business Development Bank of Canada, for an overview of the economy. I have had the personal pleasure of listening to Pierre present numerous times and have always been fascinated by his insightful and well-researched content, the basis of which I assure you will provide cause for consideration as it relates to your operations. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions ahead of time, many of which will be covered in Pierre's presentation over the next hour or so. Please feel free to use the chat function and to seek clarity, ask more questions, or share your thoughts. And with that, I would like to hand over to Pierre.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so let me get that for you. And you probably see my presentation by now. So my presentation has 4 parts. First, I'm going to briefly talk about the world economy, focus on Canada and Ontario. And at the end, I'm going to talk about 2 trends that we're watching for. One of them is the labor shortage. That is a very important issue across the country. So the world economy, the number one issue is definitely the war in Ukraine. But beside the war in Ukraine, inflation is probably the number one issue in terms of the economy. As you can see from this graph, inflation is high everywhere. In the UK, for example, it's still over 10%, Germany 8.7%, a bit lower in North America, but it's an important issue around the world. And in response to that, interest rate has been increasing in every region around the globe. And this is slowing down the world economy. So we're not talking about a recession in 2023 or 2024, but we're talking about growth that is below the historic average of 3.4%. So our forecast is 2.9. There's some forecasts around 2.5. So it's going to be a bit lower than what we have seen before the pandemic over the last 10 years. In terms of the major economies, as you can see from the graph, some economies would be in recession this year. It's the case of United Kingdom, Germany. Not only interest rates are increasing, having a negative impact on the economy, but also there's an energy crisis in Europe because of the war in Ukraine. And European countries like France, UK, Germany, Italy are all really affected by that. But other regions like in US and Canada, I'm going to talk about that more extensively, growth is going to be quite modest, actually, in 2023 because of interest rate. In the US, we're not expecting a recession, but the rise of interest rate in the US is really slowing down the US economy. So this is what we are expecting for 2023. Canada now. Well, before I talk about 2023, I want to come back over the last 2 years because it's actually a big part of the story that we're going to see in the next 2 years. So in 2021, we have 5% growth, which is quite very high growth. That was the year of the recovery. Last year, 3.4% growth. Again, that's quite significant. It's higher than what we call the potential growth of the economy. So what does it mean? Well, you own a business or you run a business, you know how much you can produce of the product or the service that you are offering. So let's imagine over the last 2 years, you went over capacity. You went over your own capacity in terms of you have labor, you have your equipment. So on the last 2 years, you were running over your capacity. Well, that's exactly what happened with the Canadian economy. Over the last 2 years, the rebound or the recovery of the economy after the pandemic has been very strong, and growth has been over the potential growth of the Canadian economy. So when that happened at the economy level, there's a good news. We create a lot of jobs, and that's exactly what happened. Over the last 2 years, the Canadian economy created more than 500,000 new jobs. As a result, the unemployment rate is 5% now. This is, as you can see from the graph, it's lower than before the pandemic, and it's actually the lowest level in 50 years. So we are having full employment thanks to very strong growth over the last 2 years. The problem with an economy that is running over capacity or overeating is you create pressure on price. And that's exactly what happened in 2022. On top of excess demand over capacity, we had the war in Ukraine that increased the price of many commodities. For example, the price of wheat has increased significantly, which is going into almost every food. The price of gas and natural gas and also oil has been increasing. So, and on top of it, we had supply chain disruption. So the combination of the three factors was kind of a perfect storm. And we have inflation over 8% in July 2022, the highest level in the last 40 years. So that's the result of this growth that we have been experiencing and also international factors. The bad news with inflation, it does have a negative impact on people, especially on low income people or people with a fixed income. When the price of food is increasing by 10 or 15%, well, this is really difficult for a lot of people. It's also does have a negative impact on business as well. The cost of doing business is increasing. The cost of raw materials or equipment is increasing. So that's the reason why the Bank of Canada, to reduce inflation, they have increased interest rate very rapidly over the last 12 months. So 8 times in the last 12 months. So this is where we are. This is how we start the year 2023. We are coming out of 2 years of strong growth. As a result, we have low unemployment. Job market is very tight. We have a high inflation, and the Bank of Canada is increasing interest rates. So this is slowing down the economy. So this is a starting point for this year. So what should we expect for 2023 and even 2024? Well, the factor we're going to look at is inflation, because inflation is going to dictate the interest rate policy. And there's a good news. The good news is the pressure on price is actually slowing down. Excess demand is phasing out. People had a lot of savings during the pandemic. They spent a lot of money, but now it's going back to normal. Commodity prices, the war in Ukraine is not over, but the impact of commodity prices is pretty much over. The markets have been readjusting. The supply chain problems has been solved. Not everywhere. We still, for example, in the automotive sector, there's still some parts that is difficult to get, but in general, it's much better. And finally, the job market is very tight, but the level of new jobs is not increasing as much, so the pressure on salary is not the same. So we see that in the numbers. The 12 months inflation that you see in blue on this graph, it's down from 8 to 5.2%. But what is very interesting is the red line, which is the 3 months inflation rate in Canada. So it means that over the last 3 months, prices increased by only 1.6%. So it's a good sign that the strategy of the Bank of Canada is working. You know, the increased interest rates slow down the economy. As a result, the pressure on price is going down. So it's a good indication that inflation will go down, will continue to go down every month. And we should, by the end of the summer, we should have around 3% inflation. So as a result, the Bank of Canada will not have to increase interest rate as much as they did over the last 12 months. Actually, last week in their announcement, they decided to keep interest rate at the same level. So we believe that interest rate is high enough to control inflation. So we don't believe the Bank of Canada will continue to increase interest rate. This is, the red line on the graph. It's our forecast. So we believe the prime rate is going to stay high, well, at 4.5% for a while, as inflation is going down. And by the end of this year, the Bank of Canada should be able to start reducing interest rate to bring inflation interest rate down to 2.5% in 2024. And that will stimulate the economy. but we're not there yet. So where we are now is, the result of an increase of interest rate very significantly, and we see that this is slowing down the economy. And the way it's slowing down the economy is because it's taking away money from consumer or from Canadians. The graph that you see is the average monthly mortgage payment in Canada. As you can see, when interest rate has been increasing, well, people pay more, Canadians pay more every month on their mortgages, has increased by 22%. So that's quite significant. On top of it, what we are seeing is Canadians are repaying their debt faster. So the blue line represent the repayment of mortgages. So people are taking the extra money, or they save part of their savings to pay an extra payment, to make an extra payment on their mortgages, which is the right thing to do, which is a good news for people. However, it's not good news for the economy, because when people do that, they don't shop as much. So you see consumption is starting to decline. So as people pay more every month for their mortgage, well, their consumption of goods especially has been declining. So if I try to summarize what happened in Canada, in 2022, everything was green. The real estate market was starting to go down, but everything else was really strong. Business investment was increasing, our export was increasing, consumption of goods and services was increasing. Interest rate has been increasing very rapidly, and this is really having an impact on the economy. We see consumption of goods is not increasing at the same pace. The real estate market is going to stay slow. Business investment are going down, and export are going down. So what does it mean for the economy? Well, it doesn't mean a recession. We don't expect to have a recession in Canada, but the economy is not growing at the same pace. Some part of the economy is slowing down, which is keeping growth this year quite low, close to 0%, and is going to improve in 2024 as interest rates start to decline. So not a recession, but definitely we are going to feel it. Some sectors are already feeling it. Real estate, consumption of goods, retail sectors is not increasing as much. Ontario now, well, the Ontario economy has been performing very well as well over the last 2 years, actually a bit better than the Canadian economy. So as you can see, growth has been very significant. However, the increase of interest rate make people in Ontario pay more for their mortgages every month. The average monthly mortgage payment is now $2,000, almost $400, much higher than for Canada, but also has been increasing significantly as interest rate has been increasing. And we see the impact on the economy. The volume of sales for real estate has been really declining as interest rate is increasing. It's stable now, and we don't believe it's going to decline anymore, but it will take probably a decrease of interest rate to see it go back again. Same thing with price. Price in Ontario declines since the top, since the summit in February 2022. So it declined quite significantly because the interest rate has been increasing. So it declined by 20%. In the other line that you have, the black line, is actually the number for South Georgian Bay. As you can see, the price went up when interest rate went down, but since interest rate has been increasing, just like in Ontario, prices went down. The average price of a house in Georgian Bay, in South Georgian Bay, is actually a bit higher now than it is for Ontario. So, but it went down just for Ontario. Having said that, when you look both Ontario and Georgian Bay, prices are still much more elevated today than before the pandemic. So we haven't lost all the increase during the last 2 years. We believe that, again, prices will stay stable. Interest rates are not increasing anymore, which will keep the market quite stable and will probably increase slowly as interest rate will start to decline at the end of this year, and especially in 2024. And the rise of interest rates is also having an impact on consumptions of goods in Ontario. So consumption of service continue to increase, but consumption of goods start to decline. Not massively, it's not a collapse, but as people pay more every month for the mortgage, well, they don't spend as much on buying goods. And that's what we see in the number. Finally, business investment in Ontario have been declining, which is the same as for Canada. They're still elevated. The last number we have, the last quarter of 2022, businesses have invested $131 billion, which is quite high, lower than what we have seen over the last 2 years, but is higher than what we have seen before the pandemic. So we can really see the impact of increasing interest rates on some part of the economy, on retail, on business investment, also on real estate market. But some factors in the Ontario economy will work to continue to push the economy up. One is export continue to do very well. Export are higher than they were before the pandemic. And this is supporting the manufacturing sector in the province. So manufacturing sales continue to increase despite the fact that some part of the economy is slowing down. So this is an important part of the Ontario economy, and that would keep supporting the economy as other sectors are slowing down. The unemployment rate in Ontario is still very low at 5.1%. This is a very low unemployment rate for Ontario. It's below the rate just before the pandemic, and it's one of the lowest rate in the last 50 years. So people are still having a job, and it's reflecting in their income. So what we call the disposable income. So this is actually the average income for people in Ontario after tax. You can see that this has been increasing. The job market is good. Salaries have been increasing. So people are making more money, which is going to continue to support the growth of the province. And finally, government spending continue to increase. Government are investing in infrastructure, in the healthcare system and transportation, which is supporting the economy. So some part of the economy are slowing down because of interest rate. Consumption, real estate, also business investment, but some other part are going to help the economy in this period of time. That's the case of government spending. That's the case also of the fact that the unemployment rate is very low. The manufacturing sector continue to perform well. So this is going to help. So at the end of the day, we see growth close to zero, just like for Canada. We're not expecting a recession, but growth is going to be more modest, especially in the first part of the year in 2023. By the end of the year, especially 2024, when interest rates are starting to slow down or going down, well, we see more momentum in the Ontario and the Canadian economy. So in 2024, our forecast is a bit better as interest rates are going down. So I'm going to conclude this presentation by two things that we're watching for. The first one is the uncertainty is still very important in the economy. And both in Canada and the US, inflation was high or is still high, and central banks were increasing interest rate to slow down the economy. So far, it's working. So it's working well. The economy is slowing down, inflation is going down slowly, and there's no recession. So the strategy is working. However, we saw 3 weeks ago that another shock could happen. One of the major banks in the US went bankrupt, the Silicon Valley Bank, which is the 16th largest bank in the US. So an important bank, focused mostly on tech startup. They went bankrupt. Not because the US economy is not performing well, not because the US economy is in recession, which typically will, be difficult for financial institutions, just because they had basically a mismanagement. They invest in the long term and they couldn't support their clients withdraw of money. So that really was a negative for them when they went bankrupt. The good news is both the US government and the central banks reacted very quickly and they contained the crisis. So this crisis that we saw in the financial sector is not going to have a negative impact on the US economy. However, it's a good reminder that when you increase interest rate very rapidly, something could happen. A shock that you don't expect could happen. So this is really what we're going to watch for this year. We're going to watch for what could happen to the financial sector or, for example, to the mortgage sector. So far, Canadians have been very resilient. The mortgage default is as low as before interest rate increase, but that's something we're going to really watch for. The banking system is very solid in Canada. We have a small number of banks They are very diversified in terms of sectors and region. So we are really safe in the banking system in Canada. The US, the banking system is different. They have 12,000 banks. Some of these banks are small, not very diversified, really focused by region or by sector. So this is that's something to watch for a little bit more than in Canada. And the reason why we're watching for in the US, as you know, we export a lot to the US. So if something happens in the US, we are going to feel it. So that's something we're going to watch for. Finally, the last trend is the labor shortage. We have a labor shortage in Canada, and it unfortunately is not going to go. It's not going to disappear. There's two reasons why it's so difficult to hire people. The first reason is because we have been creating a lot of jobs. This is the graph that you see is the total number of jobs in Ontario. So before the pandemic, there was 7.5 million people working. Now there's 7,800,000. So Ontario has 300,000 more jobs today than 2 years ago, which is quite significant. Often when I meet entrepreneurs, they ask me, where are the workers? They didn't come back after the pandemic. Actually, they came back and they are working. The reason why it's so hard to hire people, the first reason is because there's so much more jobs. The economy has been performing well, both in Ontario and Canada. So we have been creating more jobs. So we need more people. And that's the first reason why we have this shortage of labor. But there's another reason, and there's a more kind of a long-term or structural reason. And the second reason is because we have an aging population, both in Ontario and in Canada. I'm going to give you some numbers for Ontario, but the numbers for Canada are very similar. 18% of people in Ontario over 65 today, which is much higher than, for example, 20 years ago. So the baby boomers that we have been talking about for so long, well, they are leaving the job market because when you get close to 65, well, typically people retired. That's exactly what we are seeing now. In the last 12 months, 88,000 people in Ontario left the job market to retire. This is almost twice as much as 20 years ago when the situation was normal. So this is the second reason why we have the shortage of labor. A lot of people, because they're close to 65 or over 65, they are retiring. So this is the gap that it's creating in the job market. Unfortunately, this is not going to go away very quickly because 22% of workers in Ontario today, they are over 55. So it means that in the next 10 years, these people are going to leave the job market to retire. I was in Cobourg talking to the Chamber of Commerce a few months ago, and I met a client of BDC in the manufacturing sector, and he was saying that in his shop, 50% of his workers, they were over 50, 55. So that means that he's going to have to replace 50% of his workers in the next 10 years. That's very significant. So when you look at this graph, 22% of workers now are over 55. There was only 10% in the year 2000. And if I had to this graph, the new generation, workers below 25, you see the problem. You see that the percentage of older workers is much greater than the percentage of younger workers. So this is the shortage of labor, or this is the gap in the job market. So again, 20 years ago, it was the opposite. The curve were inverted. We had a higher percentage of younger workers 10 years ago than older workers. So now, because of the aging population, because of all these baby boomers who are close to 65, well, that's the reason why we have this shortage of labor. So in conclusion, the economy is slowing down, and this is expected actually. Inflation was too high, so the Bank of Canada increased interest rate to slow down the economy to reduce inflation. Of course, they don't want a recession. So without a recession, you can imagine the strategy is not simple. You want to slow down the economy, but you don't want to create a recession. So far, it's working. The economy is slowing down, not too much, but it's slowing down, and it's helping the inflation to go down. So we believe inflation will be under control by the end of this year, and the Bank of Canada will be able to reduce interest rate slowly at the end of this year and in 2022. 2024. So the strategy is working. So we are following the path. Having said that, the economy is going to grow at a much slower pace this year than what we have experienced over the last 2 years. So some of you are going to feel it. People in retail sales, people in real estate, even in some manufacturing part, producing manufacturing goods for consumers. But in the rest of the economy is still performing quite well. So at the end of this year, we should have growth close to zero, but positive growth, both for the Ontario and the Canadian economy. As for the labor shortages, unfortunately, it's not going to go away because we have an aging population in Ontario and in Canada. And actually, this is not unique to Canada. In most developed economies, like in United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, all these countries are experiencing exactly the same phenomena. So there's no magic solution for that. But as businesses, one thing that we can do that really improve what we do is to invest more in technology and automation. That's a great way to reduce our need for workers. So I'm going to stop here. We have time for questions. I would be very happy to take your question.
Yeah, thank you for that. As I mentioned before the session, it's always very insightful, and the research is most definitely there to back up a lot of the points that you've made. Interestingly, the questions that we received before the session revolved around themes around housing, rising interest rates, inflation, and the labor market. Of course, those are the things that you spent your time speaking to. I will kick off, if you don't mind, with a question about perhaps a more localized impact of inflationary figures. And this is a question that came from a gentleman by the name of Don Phillip, where he finds the inflation figures to be unrealistically low. Food inflation, he believes, is much higher than the figures given here, and factors in a big way in which people live their lives, particularly within the region of South Georgian Bay, Simcoe County, into the Muskokas, which is largely driven by tourism. Could you comment on food inflation?
Yeah. Of course, the numbers I give you was for Canada. So this is an average for Canada. The way inflation is calculated is a basket of goods. Food is part of it, but that's not the only. So food price increase is increasing faster than the number I gave you. It's still increasing by 10%. But when they calculate the full inflation, food is only one part of it. So for example, when the price of oil is going down, the price of gas at the pump is going down, and that have an impact on the total number for inflation. So food inflation is still strong. We believe that this is going to slow down this year. Supply is adjusting to the demand. The demand is slowing down a little bit. So there's a lot of reason to believe that food inflation is going to go back to normal sometimes in 2023.
Excellent. Thank you for that comment. I want to flip gears to the labor market now, which of course you spent several minutes speaking to. Do you expect the immigrant labor market to have an impact on our ability to find employees?
Yes, it's improving. And immigration, the last number we see, immigration is really increasing. And the program of foreign workers that businesses can use to attract foreign workers, we can see that the numbers is really increasing as well. So this should help to compensate for the demand that we have in the economy. There's still a lot of vacant jobs. We have more jobs than people in Ontario and in Canada, but immigration is helping that. So this is going to help, but for the next 5 years, as a lot of people are retiring, the job market is going to stay tight. So this is, unemployment rate is going to stay low. The pressure on salary is going to stay there. We don't expect salary to increase as much, but immigration is helping, but still there's so many people retiring that is not going to compensate for everything.
Thank you. I'll go back to Don, who has a second question here, as I think a bit of a follow-up to the first question he asked. So He writes, automation will create some job losses, and there will be fallout from this. There will be three groups: those unable to upgrade their skills and who will be essentially unemployable, those who can upgrade and will get jobs, and students who are prepaying for jobs that don't yet exist. What should we be doing to support these three groups?
That's a very good point. And in the past, the big challenge for government was to create jobs. We had a higher unemployment rate and we had more people than jobs. So now, for the next 10 years, basically, because of our aging population, is going to be the opposite. We have more jobs than people, but at the same time, there's a technology revolution. I mean, it's not new. We have seen that before, but technology, automation, artificial intelligence is going to really have an impact on jobs. So we really have to do a better job to help people to improve their training, to be able to continue to work in a different business environment. So that's one of the biggest challenges I see for our governments and our institutions, education institutions, is to help people who have been on the job market for a long time. Maybe they are not as as tech savvy than the younger generation. We need to help them to adjust to this new reality.
Yeah, and there are many initiatives that are certainly coming forward in that regard. Certainly our partners at Georgian College are on the at the tip of the snowplow in that regard, and are doing some amazing things with their programming. I have another question here that relates to you mentioned inflationary costs have an impact on our mortgage payments and the money that's left in our pocket at the end of the month. There was a question about the lag effect of the renewal of mortgages and whether that could have a bigger impact on consumer spending in the years to come as those renewal numbers increase, and the interest payments, of course, will climb with that.
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. There's about half of Canadians who have a variable rate. That means that each time the prime rate is increasing, well, they pay more. And we saw that in the graph in both Canada and Ontario. But the other half is have a fixed rate. So the shock or the impact is coming at the end of their mortgage. So we see that every month. There's a large number of Canadians who have to renew their mortgage. So this is will have an impact on consumption. So that's why we are saying that the economy will continue to slow down. I don't think it's going to have a bigger impact because interest rate is no longer increasing. So this is really the first step of the end of this strategy. So yes, it's having an impact, and yes, the economy will slow down, but we don't expect to see major, like a mortgage default, just because salaries have been increasing, the job market is good, people have a job, and interest rate is no longer increasing. So that should be, most Canadians should be able to absorb these interest rates.
Super, thank you. Again, switching gears, pension funds. There were actually a couple of questions in this regard. The stability of pension funds as we move forward with the boomers exiting the workforce, and then, of course, being followed by the Gen Xers in the next 10 to 15 years. Any comments on that?
Well, this is one of the challenge of having an aging population. The baby boomers, was a lot of them were paying, pension, and I would say tax as well. So now that a lot of boomers are leaving and retiring, well, we need more young people to contribute to the pension fund and also to our tax system. So that's why immigration is very important, because immigration would bring younger workers that are going to support our system. So this is, immigration is well on the way. It's really increasing. The federal government has increased the threshold in terms of the number of Canadians coming to Canada. So that will help for the pension fund and also for the tax system.
That's a more favorable outlook than I think some believe. But let's work with the Economist on that. There were actually a couple of questions about Canada's debt. How and when will it be paid back? I think there's certainly some concern about how much was forked out through COVID. How will we recover from that, and over what term?
Yeah, well, this is more a question for the government, because I'm not deciding that. There's no plan for now, but during the pandemic, they spent a lot of money to help Canadians and also help businesses, and I think that was the right thing to do. Now that the economy is performing better, I think it's time to, to have a plan for to go back on a balanced budget. Having said that, the economy, the Canadian economy is still in good shape, because our debt to GDP is still one of the lowest among the G7 countries, the most developed economies. So yes, we spent a lot of money during the pandemic, but we're still in good shape. Our debt to GDP ratio is low. Our bond rating is still the top in terms of other economies around the world. So we're still in a good shape in terms of our debt level.
Excellent. One of the issues that we certainly have as it relates to the labor market in and around Simcoe County is affordability of housing. You did indeed cover it. We're just wondering if you could dig in a little further as to predictions you have for the real estate market in this area, and the way that impacts people's ability to be attracted to this region, to live, and ultimately we hope to be able to thrive.
Yeah, prices are still quite elevated. They went down since interest rates have increased, but they're still elevated. They're much more elevated today than 2 years ago. So affordability is an issue. It's one of the challenges we have in the country is we don't build enough houses. There's a shortage of houses across the country in every region, and this is keeping price of a house very high. So it's nice if you already have your house, you see the price of your house increasing all the time. But this is really a challenge for the younger generation and also for immigrants. When people are coming to this country, they have a tough time not only to buy a house, but just to rent a house or to rent an apartment. So this is not an easy, there's no easy solution, because the reason why we don't build as much is because entrepreneurs believe that it's not worth doing it. The cost of labor is high. The cost of materials has been really high. There's a lot of regulation at the municipal level in many parts of the country. So this is something we have to really improve, because if we don't, price will just continue to increase. And like you said, it's hard to attract people when they cannot afford to live in a region. So there's no easy solution, but definitely that's a challenge that we are facing right now.
Yeah, good thoughts though. Thank you for those. Here's an interesting question that sort of boils down to a more operational local level. And it's any comment you have on how to find the sweet spot of balancing the rising cost of goods with pricing to customers that doesn't alienate them and instead accounts for the rising costs of living.
Yeah, what we noticed over the last 2 years is an increase in cost of doing business. And that was we blame the pandemic for that, supply chain disruptions around the world. We have a very tight job market. Unfortunately, this is not going to go away. We're not going to go back to the pre-crisis price level. So as a business, it's challenging because you have to remain competitive, having pressure on the cost side. Your raw materials is often increasing, the price of your equipment is increasing, and salaries has been increasing as much. So there's no magic solution. It's a good time to focus on our costs, to look at how can we reduce our costs. I'm not saying it's not easy to do, but something by being more efficient, by working on our productivity, try to produce more with better equipment or better processes. Technology will help. Technology is helping in many sectors for helping businesses to keep their costs lower, because by technology, when you invest in technology, You reduce your need for workers, for example, in a context where it's hard to find workers and salaries has been increasing. So businesses, they have to look at how they can improve their efficiency, they can reduce their costs, because unfortunately, the cost structure that jump is just going to stay at the level we are now. It's not going to keep increasing the same way because inflation is going down, but it's a challenge because it increased so much in the last 2 years.
Yeah. We have a live question here where one of our participants is hearing that some individuals are not able to renew their private mortgages because of the loan to value no longer meets the lender's required ratio. Do you see this becoming a significant issue going forward?
Well, that's one of the impact of increasing interest rates so rapidly. We never saw that, and I understand why the Bank of Canada is doing it. They want to reduce inflation, but they increase interest rate extremely rapidly, and this is causing a number of issues. As the issue mentioned there, it's one of the impact of increasing interest rates so rapidly. So far, the default rate of mortgages has been staying very, very low. So which is a very good news, and probably because job market is good and salary have been increasing. But having said that, we're going to see more of these situations that your participant just described.
Yeah. Another interesting question. Not sure if we'll be able to tackle this, but what types of long-term economic opportunities do you see for smaller communities as a result of the remote work notion that is now very much a part of businesses' lives?
Well, there's definitely a trend that we see that people prefer to work remotely. And you just have to go downtown Toronto to realize that a lot of people are not coming back. They have used the opportunity during the pandemic to buy a house, a bigger house, a nicer house, more remotely, and they work remotely. This is not going to disappear. Technology is allowing not everybody, but some workers to work remotely, and people enjoy the nice quality of life of living remotely compared to downtown Toronto. So this is actually an opportunity for a lot of communities, because when people work from a different community, they shop there. So it's not only it's an opportunity for real estate, but it's an opportunity for actually a lot of business in that area. And so I think a smaller community are benefiting from that, and this is not going to go away. This is going to, I think we have find a new balance. During the pandemic, almost everybody was working remotely. Now it's not the case. Some people went back, and some businesses are asking some people to be back into the office 1 or 2 days a week. But the balance that you see now, it's probably going to be the new reality.
Excellent. Well, Pierre, I think that's covered a very good cross-section of the questions that we had. Of course, many of them were covered in your presentation, and these questions came in beforehand. So we'll wrap up there. Many thanks from all of the partners that were responsible in the back end, including Tiffany, who's looking after the back end of our Zoom workshop here. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your thoughts and insights. Thank you for answering the questions, and continue to do your good work, and we will continue to listen. Pierre, it's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye for now, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today.